Hey everyone, welcome back to WorkTech. I'm excited for today's conversation because we've got some really meaty topics to dig into today, and a guest that's uniquely qualified with a lot of perspective to discuss these topics. We're going to get into pay equity, pay transparency, CEO comp ratios. We'll probably touch on livable wage a little bit and see how it all relates to the work tech stack. So that guest I was telling you about is Sean Luitjens, who's been in the industry probably as long as I have. In fact, we first crossed paths, we think we put it in the early 2000s when he was over at Monster and I was out selling talent acquisition software or leading a team. And Sean is now the VP of product management for Korn Ferry Intelligence Cloud. Welcome, Sean.
Hey, hello. Although I don't know how much I appreciate you saying a lot and leaning into that so much, but yeah, that's great.
Well, you're one of those folks that I think because of the depth of experience you have, as well as the perspective that you have right now, I'm always keen to see what you're seeing and hear what you're thinking. Um, and let's start though with an intro. I skimmed the surface. If you could tell everybody a little bit about you, and then Korn Ferry is a lot of things to a lot of people. So tell us about the intelligence cloud or how you position Korn Ferry in today's market.
Yep. So, as you mentioned, we'll just leave it at a lot of experience. We won't go through it all, but yeah, starting in the 90s, actually, back when the internet was new, right? And job boards were new. And
Yeah,
the
yeah,
story I like to tell people is I'm so old, we actually were paying some companies to put their jobs on our job board, if you can imagine, because, it wasn't going to work in the whole talent acquisition space. Spent a lot of time, in talent acquisition, the recruitment side of the house, comp, ben, places like that, and a little bit of time even in the international pay, comp and ben space around global mobility. And so really been all around the tech stack. The one thing I haven't done is I haven't been an HR practitioner. Frankly, George, that just looks hard. And those people deserve special recognition dealing with that. Everything we get to do is solving problems without the employees, right? And HR has to solve all the problems while trying to keep everybody happy, which is difficult, but it's super cool to work with them through the years. I think right now the Korn Ferry Intelligence Cloud is kind of the new platform that they've been putting in place, and the crew I get to work with specifically tackles what's called the Talent Hub, which, if you're old enough to remember Hey Group, it's really
yeah.
what was Hey Group. So really now is the compensation benefits. It's success profiles for companies that come with kind of best in class job descriptions, job evaluation, or org design tools, all meant for clients and to support the consulting practice. What really sets Korn Ferry apart, and to be honest, the decision I made years ago when I left Mercer was I'd never go back to another consulting shop. Um, but really what separated them when I started talking to them was they decided to build out basically a tech stack, a tech development shop on the side, and that's what would support the business and build digital products. And so I just think, it was, in my mind, it was a great decision to take all the IP that you have throughout Korn Ferry, from recruitment and all the different ways that Korn Ferry likes to help companies attract and retain people,
Yep.
and leverage all that IP while still trying to, while building out an agile development stack, which you don't see very often. Usually, consultancies, generally don't, sling great code and build great tools. But that was the part that really got me, fired up to come over here and be a part of that as they were, building out the products and continue to build out their stack.
Yeah. So it's that platform, that intelligence cloud, that's internal, external, right? There's two sides to that. Is that
There is.
yep.
So there is some, we're here to support the consultants and the tools they have, but the tools are external to our clients based on whatever piece of the business they're working with. RPO assessments, we have Korn Ferry Careers Tech, the Talent Hub, all of those tools basically are on a modern stack, leveraging all the expertise over years. So you kind of, at the end of the day, not to sound like an advertisement too much, but you end up getting kind of the best of both worlds. You end up getting all the Korn Ferry IP, intellectual capital on how to best set up businesses around human resources and recruitment, et cetera, on a modern tech stack, which is not generally what you get. You usually get one or the other.
Yeah. Well, there's a huge shift that's been happening, this sort of move to the modern tech stack, and that's
Yeah.
largely what is fueling work tech. And what I view work tech as really it supersedes HR tech, right? It's bringing
Yeah.
HR tech into the future. I view systems of work like collaboration and communication tools like Slack and Teams. Those
Yeah.
are different, and this is really and a lot of it is data driven and experience driven. So that's where this is particularly interesting to me, because that modern tech stack and the topics we're talking about today, they're really data intensive, and so I'm, when we had a conversation a week or two ago, we talked about, pay equity and transparency. And I would love to get your view as to, how are companies handling that, and how are they addressing it, and how does the data play in that around that topic?
Okay. Yeah, and that's actually one of the reasons I came here, and obviously I sit inside the pay space. For me, everyone comes to work for many reasons, but one of the I guess more blue sky altruistic versions I come is around the pay equity piece and being able to tackle that in my own small space in the world.
Cool. Cool. And so how do you see companies starting to deal with equity and transparency?
So there's two sides. So to make, I'm, as you mentioned earlier, George, I'm pretty old. So let me split this into two
Hey,
parts,
I
right?
said we're both. I said about the same. It's the same. So it wasn't all about you.
So we'll start with the transparency piece, because I think it's easier to, that's out there in the market now. And, you're seeing some interesting things around companies posting jobs from, $100,000 to $400,000, et cetera, and how that's going to play out. The Eurozone did, they have some legislation which basically says, be transparent, to be out there, and it's a little bit overarching. It's always interesting to me how the Eurozone, and you can insert your Brexit joke here if you're listening from the UK, and how you feel about that, is so different than the US, right? Because as you know, companies dealing in the US, it's 50 different entities putting rules in place, and companies that work across state lines here, it's really difficult when it's out there. And so pay transparency to me is the first piece, right? And there's two types of transparency. So there's your external and your internal transparency. Um, right now, the legislative piece is obviously around the external pay transparency that's out there, and basically saying, here's the job description, and here's what we pay. Here's what is to be expected.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are a handful. There might be up to 10 states right now in the
Yeah,
U.S. that have some sort of pay transparency guideline, but it's different everywhere, right? And I think there's some consistency, but um, I know there was a lot of criticism around some employers putting out, okay, well, 50 to 500K, like a
yeah,
really like a range that's just nobody really knows where they fit with there.
yeah,
On the regulatory side, do you see this sort of like privacy, where the more realistic regulations or the more well-defined regulations will become the norm, and people start to, states start to align with that, and companies align with that as well? Sort of like GDPR, right? That
yeah.
was the gold standard for data privacy. And so a lot of tech vendors built to that, even though we still don't have our act together around it
Well,
here in
I
the
mean,
US.
there's interesting things around that, right? So if you unpack just the regulation right now is just put your pay out there, right? No definition of what pay
Yeah.
means. So if you're a comp and ben nerd, we can unpack that in a minute. And now there's a wide range. And I think the first people to freak out were probably the talent acquisition piece, right? So you put in a cybersecurity person, and you put in a job for a, senior director of cybersecurity. They're going to self-regulate a little bit who applies to that job, right? And now you put in 50 to $500,000. who's going to apply? And so the TA systems now are going to have to deal with how many people applying to roles, right? And you start making these jobs really wide. How do you navigate that through all the tools and the TA, and will the TA tools catch up with that? I think the governments will start to rein that in. My personal opinion, so not the opinion of Korn Ferry, is I think they'll start to line that in and say you can't say $100,000 to $200,000 anymore. That has to be within the range. My question will be those who are defensive and those who are kind of go on the offensive with this. And by that, I mean you've got companies who will say, well, okay, I have to stay within the range, and I'll state the range. But until the government, and legislation states, well, what does pay constitute? And so if I put out a cybersecurity job and the base pays 120 to 140, and I list that out and you list that out at your company, that's fine. But a third company comes and says, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and back up my data, but say that including short-term incentive, long-term incentive, benefits, et cetera, it pays 180 to 200. Where's the good talent going to apply first, right?
Right.
And so then I think there's going to be some companies who are like, okay, I can play this game that's out there. I think the intent is great, right? Let's talk about pay. Let's talk about what's out here long term. But as we've seen with the like you mentioned, $50,000 to $500,000 range, I mean that's not even a thing, really.
Right. Yeah. And so I've had, anecdotally, I've seen case studies around, candidate volume being compressed based on pay being listed, but quality and conversions going up or improving, I should say, I guess improving. And, do you have any perspective on that? Because that seems like a great outcome because you're getting, the right people applying. Hopefully you're not prohibiting anyone who, who should be applying. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that? Have you
Yeah, I
seen
mean,
any?
I think as the ranges, companies that have put in a reasonable range, I think you do help candidates, right? So, the job leveling aspect to things that's out there. So, if you're at a startup, everyone's a vice president, right?
Yeah,
So that's the way it is. And so how do you job level set that versus another company? And so I think that helps candidates start to self-police themselves and say, I am applicable for this role, or you're going to get some people who don't apply that are like, that's going to be too low, or I'm at the top of that range. Where am I going to go? So I do think the intent will be that it truly will help companies kind of start to get to that place. I don't know if it's going to hurt for, in the meantime, companies who want to not post jobs, or if that'll kind of work itself out because they're not getting the best candidates by having kind of pay transparency bias. So I'm not going to post here, I'm not going to post global jobs, or if I work remote, I'm not going to post in these states, almost like you can't work in Colorado, you can't work in Massachusetts. I'm not going to post the job there. Will there be some bias around there? But I think the intent is great.
yeah, yeah. So that sounds like I don't want to read into that. You're optimistic. You feel like, it sounds like we're in a phase of the states figuring it out. We're learning about the rigor that needs to come into play around the definitions, but we're headed down the right path. Is that
I
fair?
think so. I'd be curious about the unintended consequences. If you're a calculus nerd or you like reading that type of stuff, there was a really good paper put out. I think he's been around. It was Zoe Cullen and Bobby Paxed on the equilibrium of pay.
Okay.
And basically their hypothesis, it's going to end up kind of compressing the pay, or relative wages will be 2% lower based on pay transparency, because you have to now post that internally, externally. And so you're like, George, I know you're a great performer, but I can't give you a raise, right? Because, I'll put you out of bounds, or I'll have issues with pay transparency pieces. And I think that'll happen on pay equity a little bit too as we transition there. But I'm curious what the unintended consequences will be as this goes over long term.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point because it's yet another inflection point where we're going to really need to depend on managers to like that begs a conversation with the employer. How do we put you on the path to get you where you want to be? How do we create a situation, a career path? There are a million different scenarios here, but how do we get you where you want to be in a time frame that you're comfortable with, and not create issues for the enterprise, but keep you happy and engaged. That's not what we're here to talk about today, but
Well, but
that's
I think that is the same both for pay equity and pay transparency though. So in pay transparency, if you have an internal market and they have talked about having, dots on a chart on where everyone is in your group or, in the company in your range, and that begs that conversation, right? So how do I have that conversation and communicate, that why you're here and there's
yeah.
other people in the range here? I think, in an MBA class and blue
I was
sky,
just gonna say,
every manager is great at communicating and dealing with this and isn't going to make a mistake and isn't going to falter, and people are where they're supposed to be. But now HR is going to be tasked with, well, how do I communicate these things? All of a sudden, I think more importantly, and again, it'll tie into pay equity, performance management. Am I getting documentation? Why is it that Sean is paid at the 25th percentile and George is in the 75th percentile? And it's hard for most managers to just be frank and say, well, hey, Sean, George is just that much smarter than you. He's got more throughput. And then the conversation of being able to communicate, well, here's what George brings to the table, kind of a more serious note. Here's what he brings, here's the value he brings, and here's the path you need to walk to be able to get to that point in time. It opens the door for those. And so if you're a little bit altruistic and rainbows and unicorn type of discussion thing, I think it's great. There's obviously going to be some places where that goes awry.
yeah. Well, I mean, the reality, to stick with your analogy, is that those managers who, I know blue sky, they're all great at it, but what they all are doing is they're grooming talent,
Yeah.
and they're dealing with the reality of we've got a budget, we've got a cap, we've got talent. This talent's progressed to the point where I don't have a place to put them in our current structure. And when that contract's up, we're probably going to lose them. And we need new talent coming along. And it's I, sporting analogies are troublesome, but I think it's a good one when it comes to pay, and how to and how not to. So let's shift gears to equity. How do you feel about, how optimistic are you about employers' intentions around being fair players,
Yeah.
based on everything you're seeing?
Yeah. I mean, I'll start with, I'm pretty, I think, optimistic about humans in general. I do think companies, if given all the means, all the resources, all the tools, everything else, they do want to be fair payers, right, for the work. I don't think there's obviously some not, and that's why it's out there, et cetera, or at least enough that have to be. But I think, in general, the movement will be to having pay equity. I don't think it's pushing a big rock up a giant hill that nobody, a very few want. I do think the majority wants, and gosh, I really hope so, to be honest. That's what people want. You get paid for the work you do.
Yeah.
um the legislation is right now is on base pay. So I think there's some fundamental issues with the current legislation around pay equity and how it's actually measured. So using you and I as examples again, we're in the same job. Let's imagine we actually, perform at the same level, even though you're smarter, as I pointed out earlier. We get bonus the same this year.
Yeah.
And then, so they decide to give me, give you 500 shares of equity, for doing such a great job. And because I hang out with the boss, for some reason, I get 5,000 shares of equity. Are we now paid equitably? According to most legislation, we are, but we're obviously not, depending on that value. And so I think the legislation has some ground to cover to kind of figure out how we can take away that bias.
Yeah.
And that's there. Currently, I think the ostrich method is still okay in the
Head in the sand,
US. Yeah, head in the
sand.
sand. Nobody knows. If I don't know I have a problem, I don't have to fix it, right? And I think that's where the legislation is right now. So if I don't worry about it, if I want to, and even being positive about companies, if I think things are pretty good and I don't want to tackle it, I can kind of keep my head in the sand right now. I'm not being forced to look at this. The reality is, the elephant in the room is, to remediate pay equity, there's only one way costs go, right? No one really has talked about, well, we'll just lower pay for those that are higher, right? That's not
Yeah.
going to be a thing. So the remediation means if I admit there's a problem and I go to remediate that problem, I've got compensation problems. And you know, as well as anybody, and probably most of the people on here, the way, if I remediate the fast way and don't pay people higher in the range, where are those people going to go? And so it's just a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's a really hard problem to tackle.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and the legislation that you're talking about, for those that are curious, where's that? Where are those regulations or
Yeah,
legislation?
I mean, it's
Which
in
are
the
you referring
US
to?
right now. I'd have to go,
Okay.
I
Okay.
married a lawyer, George, so I try to, not,
Okay.
spend as much
Yeah.
time there. But I think it'll get caught up like other things, I think it'll get caught up
Yeah.
um
It,
along those lines.
but it's generally like, I know the SEC came out with, for public companies, some guidance,
Yes.
and it's very loose, right? It's not very well
Yeah.
defined. If you're making statements about any human capital metrics, so you know we have a policy for pay equity, right? Then you need to demonstrate that
Yes.
you're moving in the right direction, that you're supporting, that your actions support that policy or reflect that policy.
Yeah.
But it's very, to your point, it's like, well, but there's nothing saying I've got to, like in the UK, they have to report it every year. They have to
Correct.
actually show uh, that they're making progress, that they're paying
Yeah.
equitably, and it comes out, it's public.
Yeah,
So
Canada's every 2 years. It's a big
yeah,
deal, and I think the U.S. will catch up, right? I don't have any doubt the U.S. will catch up, and then you'll have to deal with, well, define moving in the right direction, right?
yeah,
Is a
right,
quarter of a percent per year the right thing, or where, and where are the guardrails of ranges that come into pay equity? So I have to be within this amount of range for this, and it gets complicated because we generally talk about gender. So, now you
yeah,
start to deal with multiple variables around, race, religion, etc. Um, you have to report on all those, and how do you track all those?
yeah, yeah. I sat in a talk once with a CHRO who said, I can solve pay equity with a spreadsheet and a red marker. And I thought, well, that simplifies it, but I think it's a little more complicated. I think you can solve much of it that way, but it's complex, right? It's what makes it so hard? What are the
Yeah,
factors?
I mean, the thing is, it's always moving, right? So if you want to put in a great pay structure, a great org design, right? And you come in, you have a consultant look at it, you do it, you get it in place, and you look at it for 2, 3, 4 years, right? Um, and you see how that goes. Pay equity, even if you altruistically said, I'm going to go ahead, to his point, put it in a spreadsheet. I'm going to determine where I need to pay who, and then I'm going to go ahead and make those payments, and now everyone's paid equitably.
Mhm.
Um, the day that happens, Murphy's Law. We got a merger, we got a new line of business, we have, a divestiture, we got a new location. All of a sudden now, or we just hired some talent, it's wrong
Yeah.
again, right? So you're always chasing something. If you really wanted to have a zero tolerance for pay equity piece, you have a perpetually moving target. And the piece that I think is fascinating to me is the assumption of that pay equity is that everyone performs at exactly the same level. So everyone has talked about for years, on the performance management side, you want to pay per performance, right? Well, now what? So now by default, I've got one group of people that want to retain and attract the best people to pay for performance and create great disparity among my employees between performers and non-performers. And I've got the pay equity compliance person chasing behind going, why are we creating more and more standard deviations between people in each side, each one of these pieces?
Yeah.
And I think it's going to put huge pressure on the tech systems. So the work technology actually now starts to really lean into, well, how do I track this? So I could give up and say everyone's going to get paid the same, which probably means I'm going to hire not, theoretically, you'll always lean into where your pay philosophy is, right? And
Mhm.
so you end up, I'm going to have C people everywhere because everyone's got to be at the median by pay. I'm going to get median players in today's environment for sure.
Yeah. It's an age-old problem. I mean, back in those 90s when we were, from speaking for myself, making offers based on 3-ring binders with the salary data that we're now pulling up on the screen. We're looking at the market, we're looking at, similar companies, we're looking at industry, leveling, which is why that org structure is so important. But there's always a disparity between the new talent and the internal talent,
Yeah.
because when you're in, you get that bump, and
Yeah.
then you're on this sort of annual, 3%, 2%, 4% cycle. And the organizations were, especially at that time, were being aggressive to get people on board
Yeah.
to fuel growth. And is it about aligning to the external market data across, constantly, or
Yeah.
that just seems like, to your point, the costs just keep going up. Can you
Well, I
solve
think
this for us?
philosophically, you got to start thinking about, where do I want to pay, right?
Yeah.
That's the piece, right? And if you believe at a high level, then the math will work itself out over
Okay.
time.
Okay.
That if I'm going to pay at the 75th percentile, I'm going to get better, define that total realm, whatever you want to go down that track. I'm going to get better talent. You've got to pay, right? And so you're right. The people that come in, you're going to move the needle, and you're going to pay 75% of the market, right? Because realistically, right now in today's environment, right, where most people can go find a job,
Yeah.
75% of the internal market is probably different than 75% of the external market. And so I think you need to have both sets of data, because you've got internal market benchmarking, you've got external labor market benchmarking, and then you've kind of got supply and demand that's out there. So, jokingly, hopefully there's not too many accountants on here, but I've said, there's enough accountants to be in supply and demand kind of neutral. And so you've got your 4 or 5%. And so you're going to try to give your 5% to the cybersecurity person right now, and you're going to give 1% to the accountant, because, if I have to replace them all, there's enough supply out there. There's not enough cybersecurity people
Yeah.
in the marketplace. And so you start to try to create that spread. And that's what I was talking about, those opposing forces of, how do I do that? Because by definition, now I'm creating distance between internal and external people in the marketplace.
Right. Right.
And then it just gets more complex, George. You start adding location in, you start adding, like, if I've got people that are in a remote organization and someone's working in California at $120,000 in the Bay, and someone's working for $100,000, $110,000 in Texas, who's actually paid more?
Right.
Initially,
Cost of living, and
as cost of living and tax. So now you start to go down that path. And then that only gets more complicated when you start talking about global organizations, and how do you job level to make sure that those are the same job, because this comes back to the technology. How do I make sure that the job in Texas is exactly the same and scoped out to be exactly the same job in California before I even get to the critical math issue? And so pay equity, I think, altruistically, right, looks great, right? We're going to pay everyone equitably. We're going to take bias out of here. We're going to get there, but it's remarkably difficult to do. But honestly, I think it's worth, again, it's kind of what keeps me going. I think it's down the path. I think it's worth putting all the work in and having organizations get themselves prepared to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's these issues, equity and transparency are so tied. I mean, they're different in the data and the actions. But I think when you hold yourself to some accountability for equity, and then you hold yourself to transparency, and you're having the conversations about where you're taking steps to up level the organization or make it equitable. You're having those individual conversations as manager. You're trusting your people with this information and demonstrating accountability. I think they trust you back. I think we've been in this secrecy. Everything was, you don't talk about it. So even just culturally talking about comp is a challenge for us in the US anyhow. And I think it's I'm optimistic. I think there's going to be a lot of learning, not just for the employers and leaders, but individuals, and starting to really understand what am I paid and how does it relate to the market, and where should I be, when should I be making more, and when should I be taking the path that I've been given, you know? So before we get into, we shift gears again, I want to ask you something I've been thinking a lot about in a very broad term, but what about the contractors, and, you know, how do they, you know, fit into this mix? You know, the contingent workforce.
Yeah, it's not a sweet. I know there's a lot of legislation around that. I know Microsoft started that a long time ago.
Okay.
Not that they probably want to be known for that, right? So having your contractors, you know, doing the same job next to you, and there's a lot of legislation around that. I do think if you are going to compare those two, you know, it's not my where I'm super deep in
Okay.
knowledge, but if you are going to compare those two, I do think you have to kind of look at your total rewards package. So you have to get a handle on, you know, am I comparing apples to apples in that case? Same for pay equity pieces, and not just red apples to red apples, but am I looking at red delicious to red delicious and not just red delicious to gala apples, and looking at the pay, right? So, you know, the contractor is easy. That's the rate. And you can either look at the bill rate or the pay rate for those two. But
Yep.
employees are difficult, right? Because you have to start to aggregate, well, what's their base pay, their short-term incentive, and do you mean target or not? And then, you know, their long-term incentives and what are their benefits worth, because that's paid in the contractor rate. And so getting a handle on that, one, I think is important from the pay equity, pay transparency side, but I also think it's just great to have for HR from a standpoint of, you know, being able to communicate out to your teams where they're getting paid in the market, understand what's going on in the market, because, you know, we're getting more of that gig economy feel to it, right? And so,
Yeah.
you know, is there, you know, if I'm paying half what a contractor is going to make, they might not want to come here. If I'm making it close enough to where I've got, you know, a great workplace, a culture, I'm set here, my benefits are handled, I don't have to deal with a lot of that stuff. That makes it, you know, much more interesting to attract and retain talent at your place versus a contract shop.
Right. Right. So one last meaty question for you as we shift gears,
Huh?
just given the time. What are the key implications for the tech stack? We've talked a lot about data and a lot about what's needed, things that we need to look at. You know, what should employers be thinking about from a tech stack perspective to help themselves as they're going to be dealing with this? You know, that head's only going to stay in the sand for so much longer if that's the camp they're in right now.
Yeah, so for me, it's basically listing out, you know, the items and the data that you're going to need. Like you said, it's very, all these are very data driven. And so on the equity side, it's, you know, are you gathering, do you have access to know all the elements of the compensation so that I can measure it to be fair pay? And, you know, if you just want to lean into the legislative piece, what's that? Do I have access to it? Is it right? You know, where am I getting it from the best systems that you have in place?
Yep.
I think HR, I don't know for a fact, George, but if I had to wager, I would say they have more tech systems than any department. You know, they just have a lot of tech systems that they tend to have to pull data from. So can I get that data in a really good way? And then, you know, do I have the performance data? Do I have the documentation? Because as you start looking at pay equity, pay transparency, anything around that, how do I show that the differentiation was warranted, if it's warranted? And from an HR standpoint, you know, is the company doing the right thing and we've paid the right way and there's just variation, or do we fundamentally have a problem? You know,
Yeah.
so the easy case would be everyone's got the same performance rating, which we know that's false, right? So we have to go back and say everyone's just cheating the system. But if that was the case and you've got great pay differentiation, what is that from? Is that people, how long were they hired? How long have they had that? How long have they been in role? So I think this data piece and looking at your tech stack and how, you know, new is it? How is it moving forward? Where can I tie them together? Is there a platform I can put this data in? It really becomes critical to look at pay equity. And, you know, not to keep talking too long, but you start thinking about, I've got a base pay system for payroll, short-term incentives might be managed somewhere, benefits managed somewhere, an equity system. So to be a true fair payer, I got to pull all that stuff in
Mm.
somehow, and God help you if it's Excel.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Right. Well, Sean, I could keep going,
yeah,
and maybe we'll have another conversation just about the tech side of things at
yeah.
some point. But I really appreciate all of this. It's uh, yeah, they're such important issues, and issues I know you're passionate about. A lot of people are passionate about, and I think if anything, helping folks understand the complexity of it and the need to be really thoughtful about how it's approached and not just trying to throw, apps at it,
Yeah.
and which will end up complicating things at the end of the day. So where can people connect with you and learn more about what you're doing?
LinkedIn's probably the easiest. The advantage of being a Luitjens is there's not many of us out there, so you don't get a whole stack of them. Probably like LaRocque, right?
Yeah,
Pretty
yeah,
easy to find, or Sean Luitjens at kornferry.com too. And yeah, I'm happy to have a virtual cup of coffee with any. I think this is really cool stuff, and I think you hit the nail on the head, George. It's cool to watch, but it gets complex really fast, and bringing in some expertise, or at least talking to others about it before you tackle it's really important.
yeah, yeah. And I really appreciate the time you've taken to have this conversation, and I look forward to the next. And I want to thank you again, and thanks everybody for watching or listening.